If you're an Edexcel A-Level Business student looking for a video to revise all of Theme 3.2 Business Growth, well, this video is for you, as we're going to cover what economies of scale are, along with the different objectives of business growth. We'll also take a look at comparing external methods of growth versus organic growth and the different reasons for staying small. Let's get into it. And the first topic that we're going to be looking at in this revision video will be economies of scale. Now, this is a topic I typically see students struggling with, so let's make sure we go through it in a lot of detail. Now, essentially, economies of scale is what you can see on the screen now, which is the cost advantages a business would get as they increase their level of production. Now, on the x-axis, we have output, and this is just a number of products that a business is producing. And on the y-axis, we have cost per unit, which is also known as a unit cost, which tells us how much is a business spending to produce each individual unit. Now, as you can see, as the business's output begins to increase, the unit cost begins to fall. But then we hit a point of constant return, and actually as the business's output begins to increase too much, we see this thing called diseconomies of scale, where unit cost begins to increase. More on that in just a moment. And a really simple calculation to calculate our unit cost, or the average cost per unit, is that we take the total cost and divide that by the total units of output. Now, to help you guys start building that chain of analysis and explaining, well, why does economies of scale lead to a lower unit cost? Well, the reason is because the business's fixed costs start to get spread over more units. And this is the reason why that unit cost typically falls. Now, as we said with economies of scale, this comes from increasing your level of output. So we typically see the larger businesses gaining the most benefits from this. And remember from theme 3.1, when we looked at Porter's strategic matrix, looking at that low cost strategy to gain a competitive advantage, one of the best ways is through economies of scale. Because if we start to reduce our unit cost, I either make a higher profit margin or I can start to reduce my prices and become a bit more competitive. Now, to show you an example of the calculations. On the screen here, we're going up in thousands of units produced. Our fixed cost will always be £10,000 because they don't vary with the level of products that we are producing. And we have our variable costs. Variable cost per unit will be £5 here. So you can see every time we produce 1,000 more units, it goes up by £5,000. Then we just do the total cost. So we add the fixed plus the variable costs together. So at 1,000 units, we've got £15,000 total cost. But at 4,000 units, we have a total cost of £30,000. Now, to do our unit cost, as we said, take the total cost, divide that by the units produced. So when we look at the unit cost when we've produced 1,000 units, well, at that 1,000 units produced, our total cost is £15,000. 15,000 divided by 1,000 gives me a unit cost of £15. But when we skip straight to units produced of 4,000, we do £30,000 divided by 4,000, and that gives me a unit cost of £7.50. So what is happening here? As I'm producing more units, my unit costs go down because we look at the rate of those that are increasing. When we look at economies of scale, yes, total cost is going to increase because I'm producing more units, but the fixed costs are being spread now over more units. So if we look at the rate that the total units of output is increasing, this is a lot larger and a lot quicker than the rate of total cost increasing. And because of that basic calculation, that's what helps reduce the unit cost. Now, when we look at how a business gets economies of scale, well, there's typically one or two ways. We've got internal economies of scale and external. Now, internal economies of scale is only specific for that individual business. So as the business begins to grow in size, the unit cost begins to fall. Maybe they're a bit more efficient at producing the products. Maybe they're negotiating better deals. And we have several different methods of internal economies of scale. And the first example that we're going to take a look at will be managerial economies of scale. Now, when we are a small startup business, it's typical for the entrepreneur and founder to do everything themselves. They do all the marketing of the business, they manage the finances, they also look at managing the operations, producing the products. They do absolutely everything. But as the business starts to grow, we start to hire more specialized managers. I start to hire managers for specific functions. One for marketing, one for finance, operations, HR, sales, analysis, and so on. And what you'll find is that these managers are a lot better in those functions than the founder would be. So they improve the overall efficiency of that function. So they start making better decisions because they've got more expertise. And what starts to happen is that the business utilizes its resources in more efficient ways. So how does that reduce our unit costs? Well, of course, the total costs are going up because we're spending money on the managers. But the higher efficiency of actually producing more units starts to outweigh the increase in total cost for those managers. So what happens is the unit cost starts to fall. The next type of internal economies of scale we've got is technical economies of scale. Now, I think the word technical sounds a little bit like technology. Keep that one in mind. But with technical economies of scale is that when the business starts to grow larger in their production, we start to introduce more machinery, more technology, more automation within our production. And the reason why is because this machinery and technology has a higher efficiency rate than our labour do. Potentially we become more capital intensive rather than labour intensive. So as an example here, you've got the small business. Total cost is equal to £100,000. Units of output is 100,000 units. It's just one person maybe making the products. Versus the large business, total costs have gone up because we're producing more. So that's at £10 million. But the output has now increased to 100 million units. So when we look at the unit costs, well, in the small business, it's £1, but for the larger business, it's 10 pence a unit because that machinery, that technology is more efficient at producing those products. So yes, we're spending more money on the machinery, on the equipment, but the higher output rate comes from the level of efficiency of that machinery, of that equipment, which reduces our unit costs. Next up, we have purchasing economies of scale. The amount of times I've heard a student say, well, economies of scale is when you bulk buy. That's not necessarily true. Bulk buying and purchasing economies of scale is an example of how we get economies of scale, but they're not the exact same thing. But what we mean by purchasing economies of scale is that when we grow as a business, we start to order more units. And it starts to relate to that Porter's 5 forces when we looked at the bargaining power. Because if I'm putting in these larger orders, I've got more room to negotiate with. Because as a business, I would rather lose out on a deal only worth £1,000 than £10 million. So your suppliers would typically start to give you a discount. So let's see how this would look as an example. So let's say with that small business, they go to a supplier, put in an order of 1,000 units, and that's going to cost them £10,000. But a larger business now goes to that exact same supplier and puts in a larger order now for 1 million units. This is a larger order, so they want a bit of a discount. So the order cost is £7.5 million. Now, yes, it's a lot higher, but the unit cost goes down. The cost per unit in the small business example was £10, but now for that larger business, it's only £7.50. It will heavily depend on your relationship with your suppliers and the bargaining power of those suppliers as well. Shout out to Porter's 5 forces. Make sure you watch Theme 3.1 if you haven't already. Now, in terms of how this reduces our unit cost, well, of course, the total costs are going to go up because we're putting in bigger orders, but we're able to order a larger amount and we start to negotiate better deals. Henceforth, the unit cost begins to fall. And the final example of internal economies of scale we have is financial. Now, when we look at financial economies of scale, think more so when we're getting a bank loan, for example. Because when you are a larger business, the bank may perceive you as being a lower risk. And what the bank would do is that they would show that in the interest rate charge. So typically smaller businesses would have a higher interest rate charge as they are perceived as a higher risk. But for a larger business which has more of a stable cash flow, has more financial records and are able to negotiate that lower interest rate, they obviously have a bit of a discount. So when we look at the interest rates charge, for larger businesses, typically it is going to be a bit smaller than your smaller companies. So once again, how this impacts our economies of scale? Well, the total cost will increase because the interest charge is still there, but the capital raise is obviously going to outweigh it. Now, it doesn't directly lead to economies of scale, but think if we've got more funding, then we can use that to produce more units. So that's our internal economies of scale. What about the external? Now, these are a little bit different because internal economies of scale just refers to my business. But when we look at external economies of scale, this is when it applies to the entire industry that we're in. And these are going to be due to factors out of the business's control. So when we look at external economies of scale, instead of going down that line, we shift the line downwards. So now the entire industry should be getting these benefits of the lower unit cost. So what we start to see here is that unit costs now reduce because the total costs become a lot cheaper. And I'm going to show you a few examples now of why this is. Starting off with infrastructure economies of scale. So when you see the term infrastructure, think about the physical systems in place, like the road and the transportation networks, also as well about the communication network, so access to the internet. Now this is another important topic when we look at theme 4, because depending on the country we're in, the infrastructure is going to be a lot different. In developing countries, the infrastructure is not going to be as developed, but in more of the developed countries, the infrastructure is going to be more developed. Now, improvements in infrastructure, as we said with the transport networks, the communication systems, these will typically lower the cost for all businesses within that region because it becomes a lot more efficient. Now, as we said, different countries will have different development in infrastructure, and it all depends on the level of government spending, which is going to be influenced by the economic development of that country. So, what we see is the total costs start to reduce for transportation and overheads. The next external economies of scale we have is our supplier proximity. Now all this means is how close are you located to your supplier? Because the closer that you are to your supplier, in theory that should be reducing your transportation costs. So if you was to see a large supplier set up within your region, typically that specific region would have external economies of scale reducing the unit costs. And if they are closer to you, well, that should start to reduce your lead time. And we know that's going to be important for businesses operating for a just-in-time approach. And if we are operating that just-in-time approach, well, we can start to reduce our warehouse and our storage costs. Now, once again, how this reduces unit costs is because total costs should be going down as our transportation and inventory costs start to reduce. The next external economies of scale we have is shared R&D. R&D just means research and development. Now, what this one is all about. Businesses start to benefit from access to collective research and development facilities, which should begin to reduce their innovation costs and also accelerate the technological advancements. So by pooling and bringing in resources together, companies can split the high costs typically associated with research and development, such as testing, designing and experimenting. And these shared R&D facilities, for example, specialized labs, testing centers, they give businesses access to sophisticated equipment and technology that would have been really costly for them to try and acquire themselves. So working once again in close proximity to other R&D teams just allows for quicker exchange of ideas and solutions, which overall, that should start to reduce our research and development cost, total costs come down, therefore reducing our unit costs. And the final example of external economies of scale we have is labour pool. Now this is fairly similar to our supply proximity, but this time we're looking at people, because now the business starts to benefit from a concentrated pool of skilled workers in a specific area. Because in those areas with a high concentration of a particular industry, skilled professionals are typically attracted to that region. And for the business, it becomes a lot easier to find highly skilled workers with the right expertise. And a specialised labour pool often has experience and skills relevant to that industry. So from my business's perspective, my recruitment and selection costs is going to be a lot lower, and also my training costs. And some examples that we have with this, think of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is the heart of a lot of startup tech businesses. Think of Apple, think of Facebook. So if you want to work in the tech industry and you have those unique skills of coding and developing, well, you'll typically find that you're moving to Silicon Valley to be hired by one of those companies. Or Wall Street, the financial district of America. In the UK, we have Canary Wharf. Now, if you want to work in finance, you want to make sure that you live close to these areas. And the reason why this reduces unit costs, as we spoke about, is because the recruitment and training costs should be going down to reduce those total costs and therefore reduce our unit costs. Now, economies of scale sounds brilliant. We're reducing unit costs, we're more profitable, and we're able to charge lower prices. But we have this concept called diseconomies of scale. Now, diseconomies of scale is not when the level of output reduces and cost per unit increases. Students typically get that one wrong. Diseconomies of scale is when the business's output increases too much that these cost efficiencies start to occur, therefore our unit cost starts to increase. And we have 4 main reasons for this. We've got control, coordination, communication, and motivation diseconomies of scale. Now, why this starts to increase unit cost? Well, as we said, units of output is still increasing. We are still growing as a company. But the problem is now, total costs are increasing at a greater rate than the total units of output. Let's start going through those different methods of diseconomies of scale, starting with control. Now, this is when a business grows too large, making it harder to monitor and manage operations effectively, typically leading to inefficiencies and higher costs. So what you'll find is that the managers don't have as much control over the employees anymore. The business may be growing too quickly. The span of control for the managers becomes a lot wider, so they're not able to supervise the employees. So what the employees might start doing, they might start taking longer break times. They might not be working as hard because they're not being supervised as closely. So those inefficiencies start to happen because total costs increase as the business is growing, but the units of output aren't increasing as much because productivity levels start to suffer. You'll see this is a common theme throughout all of our diseconomies of scale around productivity. The next example we have is coordination diseconomies of scale. Now with coordination, this is more so across the different business functions. So with our marketing, operations, finance and HR. But as the business is growing, we start to hire a lot more employees. There's more decisions happening. The business has loads of different internal strategies. And what happens is that it becomes more difficult to align the different departments and processes more efficiently, leading to some delays. Because what happens is we're not able to coordinate those different departments. It's not just around the business functions. Maybe we are set up in product teams. And you may find that actual duplication of effort start to happen. So, once again, those delays start to reduce the productivity levels, once again, increasing unit costs. Then we have communication diseconomies of scale. Now, this can happen because we're either adding in more layers to the hierarchy or the spans of control are becoming wider. Essentially, we are hiring more people, so we've got more people to communicate through. Now, if we don't have those established communication channels in place, this typically is why communication diseconomies of scale happens. Because as I'm trying to communicate through more layers, well, miscommunication might start to happen. It might be a bit of information overload. And what you'll find is that the business's decision making becomes a lot slower. Because for me to inform the entire organisation, it's not just as simple as talking to 10 employees. I might have to try and communicate to 10,000 employees. So what happens? Productivity starts to suffer because we see delays and errors within communication. And finally, we have motivation diseconomies of scale. Now, motivation diseconomies of scale basically occurs is because, once again, the business is growing. So as an employee, you start to feel like a real small piece in this huge organisation. So you don't feel that you actually have as much impact in the business as you once did. So what happens is that the employee, they start to feel less valued. They start to feel disconnected, especially with the senior management. And as we know, as motivation starts to suffer, productivity levels go down, labour turnover rates start to increase. Now, I've used the term motivation, so best believe there are some theories coming your way. So, first of all, how we could relate this to Hertzberg's theory of motivation. Well, first of all, Hertzberg identifying that employees are motivated intrinsically through job enrichment. But the problem is, if the business is getting too large, well, employees feel they have that lack of personal recognition, that lack of autonomy, because the business becomes bureaucratic. We go to this tall organisational structure, a role culture from Handy's model. And we know this could start to impact the motivator factors, so employees aren't as satisfied. Or we can link it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, linking it to our self-esteem needs, because we feel less valued, we feel less recognised in the business, because we might have just accomplished something really important to ourselves, but as we are just that small part in a massive organisation, we don't feel that it's really impacted anything. Or we could even look at our security, our safety needs. Because I feel replaceable. I feel that the business can just replace me at any moment. So I may start to lack that job security. So my second level from Maslow's hierarchy of needs is not being met. So this starts to negatively impact the business. Productivity levels start to reduce, which therefore increases our unit costs. The next topic in this revision video that we're going to take a look at are the different objectives of growth. Now, the reason why a business wants to grow is several different reasons, and we're going to break each of these down in a bit more detail. First of all, they want to increase their market power, expand their market share, strengthen their brand recognition, and improve their profitability. Let's have a look at what each of those mean. Starting off with increasing our market power. And this one really relates to our Porter's 5 forces. Now remember, Porter argued the stronger any of those forces are, the lower the profitability of that business in the industry would be. And the two ones that we're relating to here are the bargaining power of buyers and the bargaining power of suppliers. Now, if we increase our market power, you would typically find that the bargaining power of suppliers and buyers start to reduce. Starting off with the buyers, because if we are one of the largest businesses in the market, we offer the most competitive prices or the best quality products, well, typically you'll find that there's less competitors within that industry because we're driving them out the market. And if over time the level of competition begins to go down, well, me as a company, I can start to charge higher prices again, meaning my profit margins increase. And as well, if there's less choice for customers, meaning that I don't have a lot of competition, well, I don't need to invest as much into innovation, so my costs may also reduce, overall increasing my profit. But when it comes to suppliers, well, if I'm the largest business in the industry, you'll typically find the order to suppliers will be extremely large. So those suppliers that you work with will tend to rely on you. Me knowing this means that I've got more room for negotiation. I might start to ask for lower prices for my suppliers. Because if my suppliers start to charge me lower prices, well, then my costs also start to reduce, once again, increasing my profitability. The next reason why we want to grow as a company is to increase our market share and our brand recognition. This one's fairly simple because the larger you are as a business, typically the more well known you are. And that obviously helps with customer loyalty because you can go to a random country, find a McDonald's, you recognize that brand name and you want to go there. You want to try out their new menu in the different country. So of course for the business, it develops a brand loyalty, it increases the customer lifetime value, and it makes it a heck of a lot easier to launch our new products because we know we're able to sell to those existing customers. Because look at Apple, they constantly release new products every single year and they know their existing customer base will always buy from them. And the final reason is because of increased profitability, kind of relating to what we've already been speaking about. Well, if we grow as a business, we relate to that concept of economies of scale. The level of output increases, starting to reduce our unit costs. Now that's beneficial because we can either charge a more of a competitive price, drive the competitors out the market, then start to increase prices again, or you'll typically find if you lower your unit costs, your profit margins start to increase. Which is also good because if your profit margin increases and you increase a level of revenue, the company may be generating more profit to reinvest that back into the business to generate further business growth. The next thing that we'll do in this revision video is that, well, we've had a look at all the good reasons about why a business wants to grow. But we're business students. We want to know how to evaluate these situations. So what we are going to do now is we're going to look at the different problems arising from growth. Now, we've already looked at one of them. We've already looked at diseconomies of scale, so we don't need to do that again. But we've got two other reasons. We've got poor internal communication and also the risk of overtrading. Now, internal communication problems kind of relate to that diseconomies of scale, but we are going to explain these two in a bit more detail. Starting off with internal communication. Now, as we spoke about earlier, the communication diseconomies of scale begins to happen because as the business starts to expand, there's more layers within the hierarchy. The spans of control might be getting a lot wider. And overall, the business has more employees to communicate to. So instead of communicating something to 10 people, I now need to communicate something to 10,000 people. And during the time of me trying to communicate, well, there might be a lot of disagreements. And the message I might be trying to communicate might get lost in translation. So as you are growing as a business, you need to make sure that you do have these effective communication channels in place. And the other problem typically arising from growth is this concept called overtrading. Now, we've not gone over this one before. This should be a new term to all of you. Now, essentially, overtrading occurs when a business expands too quickly without enough resources to support this, typically leading to cash flow problems and financial strain. Now, overtrading is likely to occur if the business doesn't have enough capital. Maybe we're underfunded. Maybe we've not looked at those sources of finance. We also may be giving our customers too long of a credit period. So that increases your trade receivable days, i.e. how long it takes for your customers to pay for the product that they've already bought. And remember, typically for smaller businesses, there's more inefficiencies, so the unit cost is a lot higher. But as the business is growing too quickly, those inefficiencies may become worse, so the unit cost can actually increase. and this could really begin to deteriorate their profit margins. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video is actually how do businesses grow? And within this section, we're going to look at external growths, specifically mergers and takeovers. Now, something that students get wrong all the time is they think external growth is when you use external sources of finance. This is not correct. External growth is when we look at either mergers or takeovers, and takeovers are also called acquisitions. And all external growth is when two or more companies combine to form a single entity through either a merger or through a takeover. Now, in your exams, you'll typically be asked questions about whether a business should grow externally or organically. Now, why a business would want to grow externally? Well, we've got several different reasons. Firstly, and especially compared to organic growth, external growth is a lot quicker, because rather than me trying to open 100 stores by myself, I can just buy a business who already has those 100 stores. There also may be synergies present. Remember, what we mean by synergy, 1 + 1 = 3. Essentially what we're saying is that the value of those two businesses brought together equals a lot more than if they were by themselves. Now, a great example of this could be an airline company merging with a hotel chain. Now, by themselves, they sell a decent product, but combined together could be an entire holiday package, which adds a lot more value for their offering. Also, for external growth is to gain knowledge and resources of another firm. Now, a great example is Disney taking over Pixar, because Disney, even though it was the bigger company, even though they've been operating a lot longer than Pixar actually caused them competitive issues, because the animation technologies that Pixar had was a lot better than Disney. So what Disney wanted to do, they took over Pixar, kept Pixar as they are, but then took their knowledge, took their secrets, and started to use their technology with their own animated films. And because of that came out Toy Story 3, came out Up, which grossed billions and billions within theatres. Another concept as well is, of course, economies of scale. We know because we grow at such a great rate, the level of economies of scale would be a lot larger than for us just to grow organically. And finally, we could also look at diversifying the business. Now, in theme 3.1, we looked at Ansoff's matrix. We looked at the strategy of diversification, new product, new market. Now, we know this is risky. We're dealing with two unknowns. But rather than me trying to learn that by myself, well, why don't I just merge or take over a business who already operates here? And a great example is when Meta, the social media company who owns Facebook and Instagram, took over Oculus. Oculus is the company that sells VR headsets, because when you looked at Meta, they had no idea how to create these VR headsets. So they just took over a company who already had the knowledge, and that has helped them diversify, because they are now looking at more of a long-term strategy. However, external growth is not without its problems. As I said, we're business students, we love evaluation. Now, in terms of the challenges that come from external growth, first of all, it's going to cost you a lot of money, because when we look at that integration process, merging the cultures, merging all the logistics, it's going to take a lot of time. But not only that, if you are merging with another company, say of the similar size, you may actually have the issue of culture clashes, because you may have a culture of high quality, whereas the other business may have a culture of being cost effective. So how do you merge those together? Isn't there typically trade-offs between the two? Or we could look at Handy's corporate culture model. You know, one company may decide to have a task culture, but if they're merging with a role culture, there's going to be a lot of clashes between these two. And of course, diseconomies of scale. Because the growth is happening rapidly, you are potentially doubling your size overnight. Well, the potential now for those inefficiencies, control, coordination, communication, motivation, they could all be now present. The issue that you'll find as well with mergers is that you have these job duplications. You don't need 2 HR departments, you could just centralize it and have one, which means that job redundancies start to happen, which starts to impact motivation. And of course, I've used motivation. The theory that I would want you to support this with is that job security may be at risk. We look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And finally, there could also be some legal barriers to overcome. Now, when we spoke about theme 2.5, we had a look at all the legislations. Now, competition policy tries to stop a monopoly from happening. Now, a great example is when Sainsbury's and Asda merger was actually blocked by the CMA. So the problem that you might have from external growth is that you're not allowed to do it, or there might be a lot of delays. Now, I've used the term merger, but what does this actually mean? Well, all mergers is when two companies come together and form a new company. But the important thing is with a merger is that those two companies now no longer exist by themselves. They only exist in this new entity. And typically with mergers, they must be agreed on by both businesses. So you'll tend to find mergers are a little bit more friendly than takeovers could be. So what is a takeover? What is an acquisition? Now, a takeover is when one business gains control over another by buying the majority of its shares. So typically, that's just buying 51%. Now, if you are a private limited company doing a takeover, you need to be accepted by the previous shareholders. But for a public limited company, this is where hostile takeovers could happen because the shares are sold and traded on the public stock exchange. So if you manage to buy the majority control over that company, that could be seen as a hostile takeover. Now, to make it more confusing for you lot, we have different types of mergers and takeovers. We have horizontal and we have vertical integration. Now, when you think of the supply chain, think of a vertical line. So if we was to look at horizontal integration, what that means is that we're merging, we're taking over a company at the same level within the supply chain. So to help you guys visualize it, as I said, imagine that supply chain being a vertical line. So when we look at a retailer horizontal integration, well, a retailer is just merging or taking over another retailer. And this can be a good thing because you're eliminating the number of competitors within that market. Because if you can't beat them, why not join them? And you can also start to share resources. Now, economies of scale is more typical in horizontal integration than with vertical integration. But as I said, the problem with horizontal integration normally comes from culture clashes and from job redundancies. And then we've got vertical integration, which you probably worked out what this is. Because if horizontal integration is either merging or taking over someone at the same level within the supply chain, vertical integration is merging or taking over another company at a different level within the supply chain. And we break this down into two ways. We could either look at forward vertical integration or backwards vertical integration. Now, forwards, think you face towards customers. So if we're looking at forward vertical integration, we are going closer to the customer. Versus backwards vertical integration, we're merging or taking over a company further away from the customer, further back in the supply chain. So an example could be this. A farm may decide to take over a retailer. That is forward vertical integration, or the retailer taking over the farm, that would be backwards vertical integration. Now, vertical integration is really useful for businesses because they start to have more control over the supply chain. You know, if I start to buy a supplier, I know they're now going to be a lot more reliable because I control them. So my ability now to conduct just in time improves. And as well, if I manage to take over a supplier who potentially supplies a rare resource that my competitors need, but now I own the supplier, well, I'm not going to give that supply to my competitors. So this could start to act as a barrier to entry. But the issue is, I'm a retailer. I ain't got no experience about how to run a farm. So the issue that you might find is that your resources are spread too thin and it could distract the business away from their core competencies. The next topic that we're going to take a look at in this revision video is that we've looked at external growth. Now it's time to look at organic growth. Now, organic growth is basically growing the business from within. It's not using internal sources of finance. You can still use external sources of finance for organic growth. So to identify the key difference between inorganic versus organic growth is when a business expands by increasing their sales, growing the business, without mergers or acquisitions. So as you can see, it's got nothing to do with your sources of finance. So how can a business start to grow organically? Well, if you remember from theme 3.1, we looked at one of the best theories and models about business growth. We looked at Ansoff's matrix. So realistically, organic growth can be done by any of these four methods. Be market penetration, product development, market development, or diversification. So it depends. Does the business want to focus on making new products or just keeping their existing ones? And then do we want to focus on expanding into new markets or once again just keep with the existing markets we're in? Another organic growth method could be through franchising. You gotta cast your mind all the way back to theme 1. Think of companies like McDonald's. They're selling their brand, they're selling their intellectual property to a franchisee. The franchisee buys into the franchisor, and on behalf of the franchisor, they set up a store, for example. But in order for the franchisee to have the branding and the intellectual property rights, well, they've got to pay that initial fee and potentially ongoing royalties. But why? Why would a business want to focus on organic growth? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? We love evaluation. Now, the advantages are, well, first of all, it allows the business to retain more control. So if you think about a family-run business, they're not going to want to merge. They're not going to want to take over with other owners because they want to keep that family branding. So the great thing with organic growth is that you keep control. You're not giving anything away. It also can be seen as less risky because you're doing it at a slower pace. The problem with external growth is that you grow so quickly that diseconomies of scale could potentially happen. At least with organic growth, you can control the rate of speed that you're growing at. And finally, it can be more cost effective and a less risky strategy in the short term because I'm not having to pay a large fee to potentially take over another business. I can just pay a nice fee to open up one more store. When I have enough money, I then open up another store. But the main reason why we go through external growth, it's a lot quicker. Because as I said earlier, instead of me needing to set up 100 stores, with external growth, I can just buy someone who already has those stores for me. And when we look at economies of scale, for us to access the higher levels, it's going to take a lot longer. So a business that goes through mergers and takeovers typically has better economies of scale than us because they're going to be larger in nature, so their unit cost may be lower. And finally, we may be limited to our own resources, not necessarily the financial resources because yes, we can go for external sources of finance, but maybe the people within the business. We've got to go through the long recruitment and selection process. We may just be limited to our own knowledge and our own corporate culture. And you'll be glad to know the very last thing that we now need to look at in this revision video is the reasons for staying small. Now, there are several different reasons why a business may not want to expand quickly or may not want to be a large business at all. We've got several different reasons. First of all is product differentiation and unique selling points. Now, smaller businesses, they tend to focus on more niche markets. So if we're operating more within a niche market, we can tend to focus on the specific needs and wants of customers, which potentially means we can look at more of a differentiation focus strategy. Talking about, once again, Porter's strategic matrix. The problem with these larger businesses is that they tend to want to focus on more mass markets. So yes, even though they'll have more sales, they may not be specifically targeting those customers as well as your smaller businesses might. Another reason is the flexibility in responding to customer needs. Now, as you grow the organization, more layers within the hierarchy, more employees, spans of control could be a lot wider. There'll be more complex structures for larger businesses to try and change. It might be more bureaucratic as well. But when we look at smaller businesses, we have less structures in place. We have less people to communicate through. Because if I've identified something in the market, I just have to go to my 10 employees. This is what we're now trying to respond to. But a larger business, they now have to get 10,000 employees on board. They have to have board meetings, and it could take them a lot longer. Next up we have as well is customer service. Because if you're a smaller business, you can spend more time with the customers you have because you have less of them. And it's more common for the actual founder or the CEO of a smaller business to communicate more with the customers than a large business and the CEO of them. So your smaller businesses will tend to have stronger relationships and also offer more personalized services. And the last reason of staying small, and the last thing that we're doing in this session, will be around e-commerce. Now, when we look at e-commerce, it's now reduced the barriers to entry to enter a lot of markets. Because if you go back 50 years ago, the only customers you typically used to be able to sell to was anyone within your proximity. But now with the development of the internet, now with the development of e-commerce, buying products online, it's actually reduced the barriers to entry for these smaller businesses to enter the market a lot easier. Now, if you want to carry on your theme 3 revision, I highly recommend you check out our video here on theme 3.3 decision making techniques, because we're going to go through some of the most difficult calculations in the entire course, including quantitative sales forecast, critical path analysis, investment appraisals, and our decision trees. I hope this video has helped you out with your revision. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.